The staple of the Athlon FCS Power Poll is the top 7 or 8 teams usually win and everybody below shuffles around. It wasn't the case this past weekend as number 3 South Dakota State and number 4 Sam Houston State took a tumble. Not surprisingly, the teams that beat them, Youngstown State and Central Arkansas, respectively, are moving on up, not quite to that deluxe apartment in the sky, but pretty darn close this week. Yeah, that's FCS champ James Madison sitting pretty in the penthouse. Here is the Athlon FCS Power Poll heading into Week 6 of the regular Season 1. James Madison 50, 20 CAA last week's ranking 1 last week's result 2010 win over Delaware. Of note, the Dukes leaned on running back Try Sharp 185 yards, 1 touchdown, and their defense Andrew Ankra scored on a 23-yard fumble return to capture a record-tying 17th straight CAA football win. Next opponent, number 14 Villanova October 14th 2. North Dakota State 40, 10 Missouri Valley last week's ranking 2 last week's result 3,811 win over Missouri State of Notre Dame. Their MVFC opener, Bison forced 3 turnovers and got back star linebacker Nick DeLuke and 9.5 tackles, 1.5 tackles for a loss, pass breakup from a meniscus tear. Next opponent at Indiana State October 14th 3. Youngstown State 31, 10 Missouri Valley last week's ranking 6 last week's result 197 win over Theno, 3 South Dakota State. Of note, incredibly, the Penguins held the ball for 45 minutes, 14 seconds and ran 86 offensive plays to South Dakota State's 37. Next opponent at number 4 South Dakota October 7th 4. South Dakota 40, 10 Missouri Valley last week's ranking 7 last week's result 3,833 win over Theno, 9 Western Illinois. Of note, Coyotes quarterback Chris Streveler 17 total touchdowns is having as good a season as any FCS player in the nation. Next opponent number 3 Youngstown State October 7th 5. Jacksonville State 31, 10 Ohio Valley last week's ranking 5 last week's result 347 win over Tennessee Tech. Of note, the Gamecocks are 1 win shy of the Ohio Valley Conference record of 26 consecutive victories, set by Eastern Kentucky from 199,295. Next opponent at Austin Peay October 7th 6. Eastern Washington 32, 20 Big Sky last week's ranking 8 last week's result 5,231 win over Sacramento State. Of note, just another day at the office for Gage Gubbard, 447 passing yards and 5 touchdowns plus a 43-yard TD reception. Next opponent at UC Davis October 7th 7. Central Arkansas 31, 10 Southland last week's ranking 10 last week's result 4,130 win over Theno, 4 Sam Houston State. Of note, with 294 yards and 4 touchdowns through the air, Hayden Hildebrand out-dueled Sam Houston's Jeremiah Briscoe. Next opponent at Houston Baptist October 7th 8. South Dakota State 31, 1 Missouri Valley last week's ranking 3 last week's result 197 lost to Theno, 6 Youngstown State. Of note, quarterback Taryn Christian and co. didn't find any offensive rhythm in its first loss. Next opponent Southern Illinois October 7th 9. Sam Houston State 31, 11 Southland last week's ranking 4 last week's result 4,130 lost to Theno, 10 Central Arkansas. Of note, in a telling statement, quarterback Jeremiah Briscoe said after the Bearcats' first loss, James Madison charted the blueprint to beat us, which is play man coverage. Next opponent versus Stephen F. Austin in Houston October 7th 10. Wofford 40, 20 Southern last week's ranking 11 last week's result 317 win over Presbyterian September 30th. Of note, there was no looking back after Blake Morgan scored on a 94-yard tear on the Terriers' first play from scrimmage. Next opponent number 19 Western Carolina October 7th 11. Illinois State 40, 20 Missouri Valley last week's ranking 12 last week's result 2,413 win over Indiana State. Of note, Jake Colby threw for a career-best 345 yards and 2 touchdowns to Christian Gibbs. Next opponent at Northern Arizona October 7th 12. Western Illinois 31, 1 Missouri Valley last week's ranking 9 last week's result 3,833 lost to Theno, 7 South Dakota. Of note, wide receiver Yulin Ackland 19 receptions, 343 yards, 3 TDs, and linebacker Brett Taylor 28 tackles were unbelievable in the Leathernecks' first loss. Next opponent number 22 Northern Iowa October 7th 13. Richmond 22, 1 CAA last week's ranking 13 last week's result idol of Notre Dame. Despite the return of last year's top 3 running backs, including 1,000-yard rusher Deontez Thompson, sophomore Jay Palmer is pacing the team in rushing yards 160. Next opponent Albany October 7th 14. Villanova 32-11 CAA last week's ranking 15 last week's result 249 win over Towson of Notre banked up Nova felt better after picking up its first CAA win, but quarterback Zach Bednarchuk's knee was the latest standout to be knocked from a game. Next opponent Maine October 7, 15. New Hampshire 41-30 CAA last week's ranking 16 last week's result 4,517 win over Bryant of note with 3 more touchdown receptions. UNH junior Neil O'Connors now has 8 this season. Next opponent at number 23 Stony Brook October 14, 16. Elon 41-20 CAA last week's ranking 21 last week's result 60 win over Theno, 19 Albany of Notre Dame with its first shutout since 2009. The Phoenix have beaten 3 straight nationally ranked teams under first-year head coach Curt Cignetti. Next opponent William Mary October 7, 17. North Carolina at 50-20 MEAC last week's ranking 20 last week's result 217 win over South Carolina State of note the Aggies forced 3 turnovers and linebacker Jeremy Taylor had a hand in each one. Next opponent Delaware State October 7, 18. Weber State 41-20 Big Sky last week's ranking 22 last week's result 2,517 win over Montana State of note Trey Tuttle booted 4 field goals for the Wildcats, who have been the most consistent team in the Big Sky. Next opponent Southern Utah October 14, 19. Western Carolina 41-20 Southern last week's ranking unranked last week's result 457 win over Chattanooga of note the Catamounts played without Detrez Newsome, the FCS all-purpose yardage leader who was sidelined with a shoulder injury. In his place, Corey Holloway rushed for 105 yards and 2 touchdowns. Next opponent at number 10 Wofford October 7, 20. Samford 32-11 Southern last week's ranking 24 last week's result 3,514 win over Theno, 18 the Citadel of note with a 281st quarter lead. Samford put away the two-time defending Southern Conference champs early. Kelvin McKnight had his FCS best 9th touchdown reception. Next opponent at VMI October 7, 21. Ute Martin 32-11 Ohio Valley last week's ranking 14 last week's result 70 lost to Austin Peay of note after beating Tennessee State in a matchup of ranked teams. The Skyhawks clearly didn't take Austin Peay seriously enough. Next opponent Murray State October 7, 22. Northern Iowa 22-10 Missouri Valley last week's ranking 23 last week's result 2,417 win over Southern Illinois of note Uni's defense forced 3 fourth-quarter turnovers to pull out their conference opener. Next opponent number 12 Western Illinois October 7, 23. Stony Brook 41-30 CAA last week's ranking unranked last week's result 2,118 win over William Mary of note the winning streak is at 4 because the Sea Wolves have yet to surrender more than 18 points to an FCS opponent. Next opponent Delaware October 7, 24. The Citadel 31-11 Southern last week's ranking 18 last week's result 3,514 loss at Theno, 24 Samford of note we've been warning that the Bulldogs were living off their 201,516 success. The early schedule was simply too easy. Next opponent Mercer October 7, 25. Montana 32-11 Big Sky last week's ranking unranked last week's result 4,533 win over Portland State of Notre Dame. Justin Strong had 3 interceptions and a touchdown to help get the Grizz back into the Power Poll. Next opponent at Idaho State October 7 Power Poll possibilities Albany 32-21 CAA McNeese 41-21 Southland written by Craig Haley, who is part of the Athlon Contributor Network. Haley has covered the FCS level since 1999 and is the national writer for www.fcs.football. He appears frequently on radio shows and podcasts to discuss everything FCS. Follow him on Twitter at Craig Haley. Photo courtesy Central Arkansas Athletics.